Bismillah. Scott had shampooed his hair and with his eyes closed was holding his head under the spray of the shower head. Feeling a sudden draft of cold air invade the steamy atmosphere behind the shower curtain, he stepped out of the floor and stumbled into the woman who'd just joined him in the small tube. "Dory?" he asked, spraying his face with his hand. Reflexively throwing her arms around him to regain her balance, Dory said, "No, it's Norman Bates." Her breast crashed against Scott's wet chest. He slid his arms around her and spread his hands over her buttocks, pressing her body into his. "My Norman, how you have changed." His lips covered hers, and his tongue probed inside her mouth immediately, possessively, hungrily. The steam that surrounded them was only partly a product of the hot water spewing from the shower head. Dory felt Scott's manhood swelling against her stomach, and waves of unswearing desire pulsed through her womb. With one hand she reached past Scott to pick up the bar of soap from the soap dish. She slid it over his back with a circular motion, massaging the sleek, slippery, wet muscles of his shoulders. Scott kissed his way down her neck and circled her breast with kisses before taking the top nipple into his mouth, sucking at it, teasing it with his tongue. Groaning ecstatically, Dory danced her fingers over the sensitive nerve endings clustered at the small of his back. Their bodies melded together languorously. Scott was fully aroused, and his erection pressed against her, hard, kisting and persistent. The hand that had been at her breast moved lower and insinuated itself between them. He knew how to touch Dory, where to touch her. As his fingers worked their sexual magic, Dory writhed against them. She shitted his swollen organ with her hands. "Love me," she whispered urgently, squeezing his flesh with her fingers. He said her name, repeated it. On Scott's lips it was a caress, an endearment, an aphrodisiac. Gingerly, he lowered her to the bottom of the tube and settled his body over hers. Hot water beat down on them from the shower nozzle, but they ignored it. They ignored everything but ick, odor, and the need for fulfillment that drove them. Their bodies, slippery and wet and familiar with ick odor, joined smoothly. Dory crooked her legs around Scott's, embracing him, drawing him nearer as she arced against him, half floating in the soapy water that slithered sensuously over and around them. They moved in a frantic, exquisite, frenzied rhythm, kissing, singing, groaning, urging each other on with the sounds of passion. Scott's palms kneaded her breast while his mouth branded the soft skin of her neck. Dory nipped the tender flesh over his shoulder blade with her teeth and then sucked gently on his neck before his mouth found her mouth again and covered it in a searing kiss. They found release, oblivion, and paradise in the same instant. Dory's arms clasped even tighter around Scott's waist as she cried out her fulfillment, and Scott stroked her back soothingly, reassuringly. Eventually, he pressed his forehead against her breastbone, drew a lazy circle around her right breast with his forefinger, and sighed raggedly. "Damn, you are so good." Dory chuckled softly. "I was only planning on watching your back." If you ever decide to seduce me, I am a dead man, he said. He blew a frivolous stream of noisy bubbles into the water slapping at his lips, then asked, "Do you think this is what it's like making love in the surf?" "I had say it's more like afterglow in a monsoon," Dory said, cognizant now of the shower spray beating down on them and droplets of water ricocheting from Scott's shoulders onto her face. "Why is there so much water in the tube anyway?" "One of us must have hit the plug," Scott said. "Yes," Dory replied wearily. "One of us must have." Before he could react to her teasing, she sprang to attention, twisting past him to peek on the other side of the shower curtain. "Good grief. The floor?" Scott asked. "Are you familiar with the term tsunami?" Dory answered. She pressed her palms against Scott's shoulders and shoved gently. "Oh, clever boy, we have got to get that floor blotted before old Lady Viscount discovers water dripping out of her light fixture." "Water can't penetrate laminated flooring," Scott said authoritatively. "It will stand there until it's whipped up or evaporates," dropping a kiss on Dory's temple and touching a spot he knew to be particularly vulnerable, he said. "Why don't I turn off the shower? We can pretend we are teenagers skinny dipping in the ocean." "Scott," Dory said, squiggling out from under him and reaching for the faucet behind him, "honestly, if that water seeps stuffed old Lady Viscount's sailing while you are fooling around." Dory, we are fooling around. It's no fun alone. If old Lady Viscount comes up here complaining about water in her sailing, you are going to be the one who explains how this happened. If she is as nosy as you say she is, Scott replied, she's probably already got an earful. "God," Dory said, stepping out of the tub. "You don't really think she can hear?" "Does a gator like dog meat?" Scott said. He wrapped himself in the bat blanket Dory had hung on the towel bar for him. Dory grimaced. "Don't start with the gator jokes, Scott. This is serious. We have got to get this water mopped up before." With a dramatic flick of his wrist, Scott flung the terry blanket from around his body, wielding it like a matador's cape. He bowed from the waist. "For want of a coat, milady." With that, he flung the large towel onto the floor. Dory jiggled and Scott affected an offended put. "You would not have laughed at Sir Walter Raleigh." Sir Walter Raleigh kept his pants on when he spread his cloak over the puddle, Dory said, kneeling to blot the floor with her own towel. "Look at all this water, how did we ever—" "It's that insatiable libido of yours," Scott said. Dory planted her fists on her waist. "Libido of mine? Wait until I tell old Lady Viscount how you assaulted me in the shower." "Assault? I will give you assault." Grabbing her satin slip shirt from the vanity, she pummeled him about the head and shoulders with it. Insatiable libido. And previous to the attack, Scott captured the garment on a downstroke and yanked it out of her grip. "This looks absorbent," he said, and extending his arm full length, opened his hand. The wisp of satin floated to the floor like a feather plucked from a burgundy-colored ostrich. Dory and Scott watched as a spot of moisture stained the fabric and grew until the entire shirt was saturated. They faced each other in challenge. Dory was the first to speak. "That," she said triumphantly, "was the shirt you like best on me." "Wearing only the naughty boy green Dory found irresistible," Scott said. "You won't be needing it." Dory's gaze settled on the part of Scott's anatomy that proved he was ready to back up the suggestion in his tone of voice. She let it pause there significantly before smiling up at him smugly. "I guess I won't." The sounds of a large man lumbering around in a small bathroom roused Dory just enough for her sleep-muddled brain to identify the source of the noise. Thinking Scott's hair, she contentedly snuggled her face a bit deeper into the pillow, holding onto the euphoric state of half-sleep while she waited for him to return to bed and kiss her awake. He placed the first kiss on the tender area behind her ear and worked his way to her lips. When her eyes were fully open, he slid his arm under her neck and put his head next to hers on the pillow. With their faces scarcely an inch apart, he smiled at her and said, "Hey, sleepyhead, good morning. You planning on sleeping all day, or are we still going to brunch?" Sliding her arm around his neck, Dory said huskily, "Neither." What began as a gentle kiss intensified into a passionate one. Dory drew it to surprise, ending by rolling on top of Scott and straddling his midsection, pinning him with the grace of his own acquiescence against the mattress. Her palms traced the length of his arms from his shoulders down to his wrists, and she intertwined her fingers with his. "I think I will keep you prisoner here." From Scott's vantage point as he lay flat on his back, Dory's face high above him was framed by the silhouette of her bare breast. He crooked his neck high enough to place a kiss in the alluring valley between the twin mounds of flesh. "Only if you promise to ravage and plunder me," he said, and took a roseate nipple into his mouth. His tongue flicked over it, swirled around it. He drew on the flesh, aroused by the instant tautness of her flesh in response to his touch. "I can't ravage and plunder you if you are ravaging and plundering me," Dory said. She slid her body lower along the length of his, resting her breast away from his mouth, then compensated the slight by pressing her lips over his and delving into his mouth with her tongue. She pulled her hands away from his to cradle his face with her fingertips and felt his hands settle on her buttocks, kneading, pulling her into his arms. Gently, reluctantly, she lifted her mouth from Scott's. "I have got to take care of Dolly." Scott groaned with the conviction of a man sorely tried and frustrated. "We don't want any surprises," Dory said. Resigned to the delay in their lover-making, Scott let his arms slide away from her body and sink into the mattress. "There are times when I wish you took the pill." "Me too," she said, dropping a kiss on the tips of his nose. "And this is one of them, but I'm not so. Just hurry back, huh?" In the bathroom, Dory removed her diaphragm as she held the disc under the running water and lattered it with liquid soap. She tried to remember which of them had renamed the device Dolly and couldn't. Strange, she thought, the euphemism that evolved between lovers. Dolly diaphragm seemed as much a part of her relationship with Scott as the unconventional routine they'd established. As she had explained it to Scott, it didn't seem to make sense for a woman to take a full cycle of pills every month when she only made love every other weekend. Dory gave Dolly a fresh coating of spermicidal cream and put the diaphragm back in place. Then she washed her hands, brushed her teeth, splashed water over her face, and quick, of lip gloss. Her hair was wildly showered from sleep, but she left it alone. Scott liked it messed. He found it sexy that he was the only man who ever saw it encumbered and unreal. He was waiting for her in the bed, with his elbow bent and his head propped on his hand. Impulsive because she liked to surprise him, she dashed across the room wailing like a banshee and leaped onto the bed on top of him. She dropped a smattering of lewd kisses on his face. Time for the ravaging and plundering. Logan, Scott said, for Christ's sake, Dory, have some consideration for old Lady Viscount's sensibilities. To hell with old Lady Viscount's sensibilities, Dory purred, wriggling her body over his wet, feeling grace. The sensibilities of the downstairs neighbor ceased to be a concern as she kissed Scott again, this time in earnest. It was past 1 o'clock by the time Dory and Scott made it to brunch at the Tallahassee Hilton, and after 3 by the time they returned to Dory's apartment. Scott left soon to Rafter so that he would reach the outskirts of Gainesville by nightfall. As always, although they didn't mention the time they would spend apart, their parting was bittersweet, the purity of their goodbye kisses tainted by the knowledge of the separation ahead of them. Dory settled onto the couch with the Sunday paper, but it was a while before she could get interested in reading it. The apartment always seemed vacuous after Scott left, the rooms empty, the atmosphere dismal. It took time for the routine of her life to ooze back around the void his absence created. Tonight the bed would feel too big for one person. She would hug the pillow Scott had used close to her body and still be able to smell his cologne. But tomorrow the dawning work week would leave her little time for such melancholy indulgences, and her busy law practice would be a demanding taskmaster. Dory had no time for missing Scott. It was far more pleasant to use those rare moments stolen from concentration on her work thinking ahead to the next time they had be together. Anticipation would carry her through the 12 days of a romantic drought it had to. That's the way things were when lovers lived so far apart.